Greetings. Today I will talk about studies of multi-decadal variation of upper atmospheric hydrogen using both observations and modeling, and in the context of variability at shorter time scales. We are grateful to the contributions from many people over the years and to funding from the National Science Foundation. Atomic hydrogen is a key constituent in the thermosphere and exosphere and is important to the understanding of space weather processes, neutral atmosphere-plasmasphere coupling processes, and non-Maxwellian physics present in the exosphere. Hydrogen is also a byproduct of molecules at lower altitudes, such as water vapor and methane, two of the greenhouse gases most important to the energy balance of the Earth's atmosphere. Here we will briefly review a coupling of hydrogen-containing species between different altitudes. The cold tropopause prevents much of the water vapor from the troposphere from entering into the middle atmosphere, although some does enter into the middle atmosphere via highly energetic convective storms. Methane, however, can pass through the tropopause and thus contributes significantly to the hydrogen budget of the middle and upper atmosphere. In the middle atmosphere, hydrogen-containing species undergo chemistry and photolysis reactions, and ultimately atomic hydrogen becomes increasingly dominant with altitude in the upper thermosphere. Upper thermospheric hydrogen is predicted to increase due both to changes in the source species for hydrogen due to increases in methane, as well as to cooling of the upper atmosphere due to increases in carbon dioxide. Additionally, hydrogen is influenced by natural variability, and in the upper atmosphere, a principal source of this natural variability is this 11-year solar cycle. Today, I will talk about observations of hydrogen emissions from the northern hemisphere spanning multiple decades. I'll also talk about model simulations of hydrogen sensitivity to solar variability and greenhouse gases, and end with a few comments on future studies and conclusions. Some of the questions that we're trying to address are what is the predicted response of hydrogen to natural variability and to greenhouse gas increases, and how does this predicted change compare with observations, and to what extent might thermospheric hydrogen serve as a diagnostic of climate change processes. So the Balmer alpha emission is a solar excited emission, so we can use the Earth shadow to help determine the altitude of the base of the column from which the emissions arise. So this picture depicts the shadow altitude, where the shadow altitude is defined as a perpendicular distance to the location at which the observing direction intersects the shadow. Typically, the Balmer alpha observations contain both the terrestrial geochronal line as well as the galactic line, though many of the observations that we'll be discussing today were pointed in regions of the sky to minimize that, in which there's very little galactic emission, to minimize galactic emission. Okay, so first I'll talk about variability at shorter time frames. So the first is the Dusk-Dawn asymmetry. This is work by Maggie Gallant and Edward Merkowitz et al. So here first I want to point out that we can see that the intensities are decreasing at higher shadow altitudes. So the observed intensity is higher at lower shadow altitudes where a larger column of hydrogen is illuminated by the sun. Secondly, we can see that there is a higher intensity observed at lower shadow altitudes, closer to the exobase region during during the dawn versus dusk. So this is a comparison of observations pre and post midnight, and the dusk-dawn asymmetry is more prevalent during winter months and least prevalent during summer months. The sensitivity of these observations can facilitate their use for comparison with models and model validation. Next, wanted to discuss hydrogen variability over solar cyclic timeframes. So the leftmost panel shows observations taken by the Wisconsin H-alpha mapper Fabry-Perot when it was at the Kitt Peak National Observatory in Arizona. These observations indicate that a higher emission was observed during solar maximum compared with solar minimum times. The middle panel shows a comparison of 3 solar minima, where 2 of those were taken by this WAM instrument, and the earlier solar minimum was taken by an instrument at Wisconsin, another mid-latitude site, and with a scanning Fabry-Perot. These observations agree to within data uncertainties. The third shows comparison between 2 solar maxima periods. The green points were taken from Wisconsin with a scanning Fabry-Perot. The red-blue points were taken with annular summing instruments, where the red and blue were taken during the same observing period, the blue from Wisconsin, the red from Kitt Peak, Arizona. We can see in this case between the 2 solar maxima, there's higher intensities during the latter solar maxima period. So the next plot will illustrate, we will be plotting the intensity at a mid-range shadow altitude of about 2,800 kilometers, which is past the shadow altitude at which the dusk-dawn asymmetry is prevalent. And so observations were fit, and then the point at 2,800 kilometers was plotted in this subsequent plot. So this shows the extended Northern Hemisphere mid-latitude Balmer alpha emission data set. Each of these bins represents about a half-year bin spanning winter conditions, so only the winter months are plotted on this particular graph. Each point represents many spectra and in most cases multiple nights. The error bars indicate uncertainty in the relative intensity. Also superimposed on this plot is the F10.7 centimeter solar radial flux to give a measure of solar activity. As we can see, there is a apparent increase between the latter solar maximum compared to the solar maximum at 1990-91. The red and the purple and blue indicate uncertainty in the relative intensity calibration. The error bars also represent uncertainty in relative. The error bars indicate uncertainty in the relative intensity calibration. The red and blue, the blue and purple indicate give a measure of uncertainty in the absolute intensity calibration. So because the solar activity was higher during the 1990-91 solar maximum, we might have expected that actually the intensities here would be higher than during the year 2000, but this is not the case. Thus, the data suggests an increase that has not been accounted for by experimental factors, and with the caveat that this is a limited data set, and that this increase is counter to what might have been expected due to our previous observations of the change in intensity with solar activity. So next I'll talk about model simulations. These were done with the global mean model from NCAR. So that is a one-dimensional model in the middle and upper atmosphere, a one-dimensional model of the time GCM. The leftmost plot shows simulations whereby we looked at both solar maximum and minimum conditions. The minimum are represented in blue, and the dotted curves represent a doubling of greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide. Now, this doubling scenario is just a simulation, not historical values. What we see here is that the solar cycle has a major impact on the density in the upper thermosphere. Additionally, the response to greenhouse gases is larger at solar minimum than at solar maximum. The plots to the right show simulations in which we separately doubled methane and separately doubled carbon dioxide, and then doubled both of them. And what we have done here is we look at a percent difference in these simulations compared to a base case scenario. What we see, the middle plot is for solar maximum, the right plot is for solar minimum conditions, and what we see here is that there's a larger response at solar minimum, and that larger response is largely due to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide cooling has a larger effect at solar minimum than at solar maximum. In conclusion here, both carbon dioxide cooling and methane both lead to predicted increases in hydrogen in the upper thermosphere, but this response depends on the phase of the solar cycle. Okay. This next plot is preliminary results from the Whole Atmosphere Community Climate Model Extended. So we analyzed the simulations used by Stan Solomon et al. In their studies of whole atmosphere climate simulations. So WACOM-X is a model that extends from the surface to the upper thermosphere. It's a three-dimensional global circulation model. Here we're plotting global average ensemble run. Here we're plotting global average values, and what we've done here is we've plotted 5 different runs from the early 1970s and 5 from the early 2000s, and this is a percent difference plot where the percent difference is taken with respect to the mean of the 5 runs from the early 1970s. So what we see here is that in the upper thermosphere, the predicted change in hydrogen is about 8% over this 30-year time period. Well, not exactly the same time period as for our observations. The length of the time period is approximately comparable to those of our observations. In the future, we would like to actually look at climate simulations that are more comparable to the actual years of the observations and look at simulations over shorter time differences. So next I'll talk a bit more about future studies. So we want to use forward modeling as was done by Gallant et al. In order to compare our observations with WACOM-X simulations. Gallant et al. Used the background thermosphere and hydrogen density profile from the MSIS model as inputs to the global resonance radiative transfer model of James Bishop, and the hydrogen profile was extended to the exosphere with the Bishop analytic model. So then the forward model predicted intensities that would be observed from the ground, and as depicted here, the predicted intensities do show a dawn-dusk asymmetry, although the magnitude of the intensities differs from those observed. So we want to do a similar study with WACOM-X and the observations, long timeline observations. Also, our collaboration is planning for future observations with the INSPIRE Fabry-Perot that Edwin Merkowitz, the PI of this instrument, is in process of planning for a move to Wisconsin, and with the WAM instrument, which is currently at Cerro Tololo, Chile. These observations would provide coincident northern and southern hemisphere bomber alpha observations. Also, the INSPIRE observations will add observations during a fourth solar minimum period to the northern hemisphere data set, and the southern hemisphere data set will now be extended to span over approximately one solar cycle. So our future work involves forward modeling to compare the observations and WACM-X, additional climate studies with WACM-X, extending our data records with new observations, and also continued education and outreach. Our conclusions include that we have seen a statistically significant solar cycle variation in the observed intensities, with the suggestion of an unexpected increase in hydrogen emission intensities between two solar maximum periods, with the caveat that this is a limited data set. Model simulations predict that both carbon dioxide cooling and methane increases to the source species are predicted to lead to increases in thermospheric hydrogen, and that future work will consist of analysis of existing and new observations and new model simulations, and use of forward modeling to compare observations with model predictions. Thank you very much, and please contact us with questions or feedback.